We are happy here today to be hosting our panelists for our first panel of this event. And the title of our panel here today is Making Our Histories in New Spaces. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce our panelists. As I mentioned before, the mission of the Kutsche office is to feature the diversity of our West Michigan history. And this type of history reflects an increasingly diverse community and provides a framework for understanding the past lived experiences of a variety of different people in our area. And one of the reasons that we wanted to have this panel in particular this year is because recently there have been many calls to sort of turn away from this knowledge, to limit discussions of diversity and discrimination, and especially to downplay and sanitize African American history. And in contrast, we here at the Kutsche office and our president, Philomena Montella, has highlighted Grand Valley State University's responsibility to be a force for institutional change and against systemic racism, both on campus and in the broader community. And we here at the Kutsche office feel that learning about our diverse past is one component of bringing forward the multiracial democracy that we aspire to live in. And so this is one of the reasons we convene this panel today. With this panel, we seek to showcase some of the ways that local community leaders have sought to bring this history forward and how they did this important work. And each panelist will speak about their experience for around 5 to 10 minutes. And then we will have time for both questions from myself, from the audience, maybe questions between each other. And we'll also have time for questions from our virtual audience on the internet out there. And you all out there, I want to let you know that you can chat your questions within the Zoom window, and our esteemed staff person, Mary Williford, will share those questions as time permits with the rest of the group as well. So we have 4 panelists today. Our first panelist for today will be Kate Crosby, Curator of Exhibitions and Facilities Manager for the Tri-City Historical Museum, where she recently worked on the Finding Hezekiah exhibit about Hezekiah Smith, a 19th century African-American farmer who lived in Ferrysburg. Kate, could you wave for a moment? Thank you. All right. And then following that, we will have Rebecca Hopp, former mayor of Ferrysburg, Michigan, who successfully petitioned for the city's first Michigan State historical marker honoring Ferrysburger Hezekiah Smith. Then we will have Kimberly Van Driel, Director of Public Space Management for Downtown Grand Rapids, Inc., who has orchestrated the Women's Way murals, featuring women from Grand Rapids history, amongst other projects. And then last but not least, we will have Matthew Vriesman, the creator of the anti-racist APUSH history site and a Kent County Public School System educator, whose APUSH, as APUS history is known to people who take APUS history or talk about it. His curriculum includes classroom-ready material on African American history in the early 20th century Grand Rapids area. And so I'm really looking forward to this panel, and I just want to thank you all again for coming. And we'll have Kate go ahead and speak, and I will hopefully successfully show Kate's slides here. Yes.
Okay, excellent. Good afternoon, everybody. So as I've been introduced, my name is Kate Sheeher. I am the exhibits curator and facilities manager at the Tri-Cities Historical Museum in Grand Haven, Michigan. So those are 2 very different, exciting hats, but I get to talk about the fun exhibits part today, so that's always exciting. Working with Rebecca Hopp from the city of Ferrysburg and Jeanette Wyden from the Loudoun District Library, which serves both Grand Haven and Ferrysburg, we sort of work together to uncover and find Hezekiah. So I'll let Rebecca talk more about the beginning stages of this because I was looped in a little bit later in the process. But needless to say, the minute that I found out more, even just like the tiniest bit about him, I was fascinated. I wanted to know more. He seemed like the most interesting figure that I'd heard about in quite some time in terms of Tri-Cities history. Also, just to clarify, the Tri-Cities are Grand Haven, Spring Lake, and Ferrysburg. So I'm going to keep saying Tri-Cities a lot. It occurs to me I should clarify that. But for the first slide, it'll just have, again, my collaborators. Okay, so yes, the project. So he was born around 1815. We're not precisely sure of the date because we don't have that type of record, and we'll go into why a little bit later. But he was born around the Ohio area. Again, 19th century records for Black Americans, especially if they may have been enslaved, can be a little tricky to find or to verify. He was a farmer and he was a civil rights activist, and his pursuits and achievements in both of those fields are just incredible. He was a really, really long-lived person, especially from the 19th century. And in the 50-ish years that he lived in the Tri-Cities, he accomplished a significant amount. So part of why we wanted to research him was to learn a little bit more about, the bayou and the bridge that were named after him. I was looped in to help with some of this research when Mayor Hopp started the process of trying to do this nomination for the marker. So I got involved a little bit later on, but our museum's mission is creating connections to local history. So part of what I wanted to do is to look at this project and take advantage of a brief opening that occurred in our exhibit schedule to say, let's share more about Hezekiah because this marker has just come out. Let's give people an opportunity to really dig in and also talk about the challenges of researching for 19th century Black Americans what that process looks like, because it can be quite tricky. Slide. All right, so yes, this is all three of the collaborative partners and all of our process. So my involvement with this project started in the middle of the first COVID shutdown, which meant that I was restricted to online searching. So I got real comfortable with Ancestry again after a brief hiatus. And we were trying to resolve a lot of different conflicts in these documents. Some censuses would say he was born in 1814 in Ohio, others 1816 in Kentucky. And so we're trying to reconcile all of these different documents. As we got further on in history, it became a little bit clearer, but not much. So trying to build a consistent, cohesive narrative, especially with changing children's names in every census, was a bit of a challenge, but I think that we navigated it fairly well. Slide. So I'm a huge artifact-based exhibits person. This is my favorite thing to do. We didn't have any artifacts about Hezekiah. We didn't have any physical 3-dimensional or 2-dimensional pieces that we have in our collection or that we could borrow that we knew could be attributed to Hezekiah. So this is a bit of a challenge. We have the marker now, but I'm not allowed to bring that to the museum, unfortunately. So I had to figure out how to make an exhibit space that could share information about Hezekiah without relying on my favorite traditional materials to use. So instead, what we decided to do was frame the exhibition as a timeline, sharing his different documents. So the 1850 census, the 1860 census, so on and so forth, kind of sharing that research process with visitors too, not only to look at how do we tell these stories, but also how can you find information for your stories when you're going through, because our museum does get a lot of questions about genealogy more broadly. So we had the family tree, we made these reproductions of the documents, which fortunately my assistant curator, Jen, was able to clean up the images of so that we could make sure that they were as readable as 19th century censuses can get. So, handwriting being what it is, it's always a little exciting to look at that. But we added the family tree. There are a couple of different folks who may have been his children, may have been children living with him and his wife at the time of the census. It's not entirely clear. There's at least one young lady who was living with them who appears to have been adopted by them. The rest of them, it's a bit of a mystery, so finding descendants has also been incredibly tricky. Slide, please. So this is just our sort of brief information. We had a tiny gap in our exhibits calendar open up because we were shifting some dates around, COVID continues to have fun, right, in terms of scheduling. So we had about a month, and I wanted to make sure that we were able to talk about Hezekiah and to get a chance to sort of squeeze him in instead of having to wait several years due to our current calendar setup. Hopefully, in the future, as we get more and more information about him, ideally from descendants, that would be really cool. We could revisit him as a subject. But for the time being and with the materials we had available, you know, the month was probably about as much as we could have actually covered. Slide, please. So this is an exterior view of the exhibit. You can see the timeline. We have a ton of these image repros. You'll also see the content wording there. I'll get into that a little bit more in a second, but it's always good to remind visitors that 19th century language is not like how we speak today about groups of people. And so just warning visitors as they were going in, like, you're going to see language because we're reproducing these documents faithfully. That is not the museum endorsing this language or anything like that. We just wanted to share it with you as it was published at that time. Slide, please. This is a sort of close-up that we used for social media to show some of the newspaper articles. One of those documents is the, we've got a couple of different newspaper articles. I believe that one is a sale document. So part of how we were able to track Hezekiah's presence is through different land records, which again, Rebecca will get a lot more into. She was the brave soul that got to go down to the county land office for those records. But just trying to share with people, you know, this is the type of information we actually do have. These are the types of sources you can actually go look at. Slide, please. And this was the very confusing family tree. It wound up being difficult. The first two names on that third row are William and John, who we believe may have been fostered by Hezekiah. They weren't probably his actual children. They don't appear in any other censuses, just the 1850 census. So it's a little bit tricky to figure out their exact relationship. And the birth dates would have made Hezekiah and his wife Lucinda very young parents. Not outside the realm of possibility, but it didn't seem particularly likely. Next slide, please. So one of the main challenges with this entire exhibit was the process of making this interactive and engaging, right? I had done one of my least favorite things to do, which is basically put a book on a wall. And so how am I going to get visitors to actually engage with this and find it interesting? Well, we came up with a couple of different interactives that we wanted to do to make it interesting for visitors when they came in. One of them is this sort of oral history questionnaire that was geared more towards children and younger visitors, because one of the sort of interpretive viewpoints that we took through this exhibit was that it was easy for us to find certain pieces of information about Hezekiah, about information that would have been available to the government. So for example, what pieces of land he owned, roughly how old he was, but we don't know anything about his favorite color. We don't know what types of food he liked to eat. We don't know anything about who he was as a person through most of these documents. There's maybe like one or two newspaper articles that give us a little bit more insight, but for the most part, it was very much demographic information. So sort of thinking about that and asking visitors, you know, what would people know about you through government records as opposed to records from your families? So giving them the opportunity to have this oral history. The other was more of a genealogical research handout, which we probably had needed to do at the museum for a minute anyway, but just sort of helping visitors think through, like, here are some places where you can look. You might be able to find some information on your family here, not only to help them sort of think, you know, this was such a cool project, I wonder more about my own ancestry, but also to help our beleaguered collections team out with all of the research requests that they've gotten, which are many. Slide, please. So this slide and the next one are both the PDF versions of the genealogical resources that we had available for visitors to use. So this was a handout in the exhibit, just kind of passively sitting. We deliberately made it so that it could be used afterwards also, so it doesn't have any mention of Hezekiah in the interactive. We wanted it to be something that our front desk staff could continue to hand to visitors throughout the next forever, or until better records come along. Slide, please. Just more information, our local history archives, the historical newspapers that we have access to, local historians, and their published works, etc., sort of trying to give visitors a picture of the scope of sources that you can use. Slide, please. And this was the Creating Your Own History oral history form. So, since we geared this more towards children, it wasn't a bunch of like deep, dark questions, more stuff like, what was your favorite subject in school? Or what was your favorite musical album? The sorts of questions that you can't really ask people when they're gone, and you might not be able to find that answer. And it's something that, I think if Hezekiah had built out a form similar to this, I would cry. I would be so excited. Because that's one of the challenges of doing history like this, is not being able to get a good picture of who he was as an actual like living, breathing person. Slide, please. So Hezekiah had a couple interesting myths, as many 19th century historical figures do. There was the sort of like positively viewed myth that he was involved in capturing a murderer who was attempting to flee the scene and then rowing him back across Spring Lake and the Grand River in a canoe. It sounded pretty spectacular, right? In terms of like, this was very entertaining and I wanted to know more about it. I know that this was a driving point for both of us in terms of like, did that actually happen? I don't think that actually happened. So going through and looking for those records and not being able to find anything, I mean, I found like very detailed newspaper articles going back and forth talking about everything that happened with that particular murder case, the trial, etc. At no point was Hezekiah mentioned. So unfortunately, part of the exhibit process was shooting that myth down and saying, I don't think it happened, guys. I really wish it did, but I can't find evidence. The second myth was a little bit more, and by a little bit, I mean a lot more, uncomfortable, right? So the second myth was that Hezekiah had been part of a group of Black residents, the Spring Lake Ferrysburg area, who were threatened and chased out. There was actually a newspaper article published in 1915 of a lumberjack telling this story, obviously some like 50 to 60 years after it had happened. So the idea was that this group of white settlers wasn't happy with having Hezekiah and his Black neighbors all around there. The language used was incredibly offensive. And the gist of the story is that they pretended to be federal troops preparing to take the Black settlers back down south to be enslaved or re-enslaved. And so then they were allegedly frightened off. And after about 20 years, Hezekiah returned. This is another myth that I was able to disabuse mercifully, I think. It couldn't find any evidence that this was true either, in spite of the newspaper article. At no point do we have Hezekiah leaving for any length of time. At no point do we have any of these other families leaving. Individuals coming and going in the different censuses, yes, but the main families who had been here were still here in the 1850, 1860, and 1870 censuses. So I didn't find any evidence that there was this mass event. I do think that there's a kernel of truth in here, almost certainly, in terms of the amount of harassment that probably he experienced and that other residents experienced during this time. But I don't see any evidence of like a huge conspiracy or anything like that. But so I was glad to disabuse this myth. But it was definitely very frustrating, especially to see that the newspaper article had then been reprinted in like 1985, I think. Is that right? Yeah. And they had cleaned up the language in the newspaper article somewhat, but still to modern readers, it's not great, even in that version, which ties into the second point on here of discussing historical language in context. So throughout the exhibit and throughout all of these historical documents, the documents are using terms that we do not currently use as historians. It's using language that's not what I would use, certainly, in polite conversation. And in the article about Hezekiah being chased off in particular, the language is especially colorful. So we wanted to make sure that we were balancing the needs of visitors to be able to see history as it happened and to not whitewash things, while also being aware of the fact that this language is, I find it upsetting and offensive, and I'm not the person who's being targeted by it. So to make sure that we were sensitive to those needs, we had the blanket warning as people entered the gallery, but we also had the specific warning linked to the newspaper article from 1915 that we had quoted to show them, this is, we the museum do not agree with this, but we are showing it to you to show you what the myths were like, what his life experience was like, and what he probably would have fought against in some way, shape, or form in terms of his lived experience. So slide, please. So this is a photocopy of the 1915 version of the article. I did not put the entire article in here. I figured that, sort of the headline and credit line would probably give us a pretty good example of what exactly they are referring to in here. The quote, "obnoxious Negroes," is used very frequently throughout this. There's also representations of Hezekiah Smith as someone who was illiterate, which we know not to be true. He marked that he was able to read and write on multiple censuses, placed advertisements in the local newspaper, putting exhibits for sale, so on and so forth. So we know that's not actually accurate. Slide, please. So our solutions for both of these functionally came down to helping visitors contextualize what they were seeing and how they could interpret it, to show them, here's how we debunked these various myths. Here's how we tried to give a more accurate picture of Hezekiah's life. And again, a very specific warning for the 1915 article, because I used to do history in South Carolina, and that was spectacular even by those standards. So, not pleasant, but important to cover. Slide, please. So overall, was this the most engaging exhibit I've ever designed? No. It was a book on a wall still at the end of the day. I mean, we had various points where we were trying to contextualize, trying to do history on people who may have been enslaved, and who may have changed their personal histories to try to camouflage that fact, to hide from slave catchers, etc. We talked about all of these different issues, but if a book on a wall isn't your favorite exhibit experience, it wasn't going to be something that was deeply engaging to a lot of visitors as they came in. Was it controversial? We didn't hear any complaints, is how I will briefly answer that, but I don't know how many people actually were able to make it through because the exhibit was relatively short compared to what we normally do. We tried to make sure that we were balancing the needs of accurate representation versus, being mindful of the effects that this type of language can have on people. So we wanted to make sure that we were meeting things in the middle-ish there. I do think it was definitely educational, and it was an educational experience also to conduct that research and to be able to go through and really dig into Hezekiah's life. But if I had it to do over again, I definitely would want some actual artifacts. So we'll see. Hopefully when more news and more information about Hezekiah comes out, maybe we'll be able to find some descendants who will have more of those stories, more of those artifacts, more of who he was as a person. But in the meantime, I do think that this is a good start for Hezekiah. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. I think we'd love to hear more about that, and maybe after we have the other panelists speak, if you could hold it, maybe. Thank you. I'm sure, and right after the panel too, we're going to have a short break. So maybe the panelists would like to hear more about that as well. But it'd be great if you could just hold it for a little bit more so we can have the other panelists offer their things. Thank you. So next we're going to have Rebecca Hopp to continue our discussion of Hezekiah Smith. And it's totally up to you what you want to do. That's fine too. But if you want to stand, I think that you should come here. And we need to find your PowerPoint here. How about this one? It's totally fine. Oh, no. No.
Welcome. What an opportunity that I was invited to share this experience with you. I do teach full-time out at the Ottawa County Career Line Tech Center, and I am the former mayor from the city of Ferrysburg. So there was, during the presentation, you'll see the huge collaboration between those two spaces. Let's see. So just kind of piggybacking off from what Kate did, she and I really collaborated on this experience. So in February of 2021, I began the research of this, mainly because I live on the bayou, Smith's Bayou, and also Smith's Bridge, but I was presenting in front of a grant panel and down at Lansing for the Michigan DOT for a grant that we were trying to get the bridge to be rebuilt or refurbished. And during that conversations, people were asking me from the DOT, how did the name come about and all this, and I didn't have the answers for them. But since I have followed up with them, and long story short, I was able to get Smith's Bridge on the 2024 docket when it's going to be rebuilt. So that's one of the things I champion. Anyways, but back to Hezekiah. So as what Kate said, he and his wife came to Spring Lake area around 1842. And then more importantly, in 1849, I found documentations of his first land purchase. And he purchased 50 acres, roughly 50 acres along the shores of Smith's Bayou. During the next multiple years, he increased that acreage to over 500 acres, which runs from the mouth of Smith's Bayou all the way up, if you know Ottawa County, into Norton Shores area up near Taft. So it was a huge area. He was successful in his peach and apple orchards, and along the way in 1866, the state of Michigan Horticulture Society recognized him as a very successful farmer. Then moving forward, his other contribution to the community is that he was a very strong civic leader. He was the president of the Colored People's Convention, Muskegon, Ottawa County, and a delegate to the state convention in 1860, 1894, represented the Equal Rights Convention. So with that being said, you could definitely show that he was literate and he was very engaged in the community, more than maybe some of the other records may have represented him as. In 1884, his wife, Lucinda, had passed away, and we did find her burial site at the Spring Lake Cemetery. So if you're going back on that, the records do show her as being a white female. So we're not sure, was she white or African American, but that's what the records show. In 1884, Hezekiah marries Ellen Hicks Bennett, and then she has passed away in 94. In 94, she marries Sarah, who then returned back to Grand Rapids after his passing in 1896. So this goes on with what I just shared a little bit about Kate with the Tri-City Historical Museum, helped out tremendously. Jeanette Whedon and John Martin at the Loudet Library. But then also I was able to connect in with Annalise Cox, PhD, with the Harvard University of Hutchins Center for African American Research. She also authored the Michigan African American Pioneers, where Hezekiah has an article in there. It was great conversations with her, and definitely was able to assist with some of the research. In September of 2021, the application, I presented that in, and it was approved by the city. And actually then I received a wonderful email from the Michigan Historical Group marker that we did receive the first ever historical marker for the city of Ferrysburg. So I was very elated with all the work that we had put into that. Along the way, I applied for the Drake Middleston Heritage Fund grant, which actually paid to cover the cost of that large marker, because of course we put so much work into it. I wanted the very largest marker that we could possibly get, and we did. And then along the way, the Grand Haven Community Foundation opened up a competition for doing site improvements and that within different municipalities up in the Tri-City area. And we were awarded to do a site improvement, and I'm focusing right now on universal accessibility because it does connect in with our bike path. And I think that'd just be a wonderful asset to have. That universal accessibility will be brought up again as I continue through this presentation. August 13, 2022 was a very important date. We dedicated the marker that day. We only received it 3 days prior. So our DPW guys had to work really hard. That is the anniversary of his first purchase, land purchase. And so I really wanted to recognize that date. So when I applied back in February, probably July of 2021, I used that date as a dedication date. And as time went on and doing all the revisions for the marker, I wasn't certain if we were going to be able to uphold to that date, but we did. And then the attendees were the staff at the Tri-City Historical Museum, the historical marker rep that we had. It was wonderful to meet him finally, elected officials from the community, and also many community members. In fact, one of our special guests was the new superintendent for Muskegon Public Schools. So it was wonderful to meet her. Moving on with the collaboration. I collaborated when school started in the fall with 2 students at the Career Line Tech Center. One, Ethan Doxey, is in our class. Wonderful young man, a senior at Hamilton High School, and has a fabulous voice. And he's the one that has done the audio recording of the historical marker. And then I reached out to software game development, and Aiden Palmas is a senior at Jenison High School, and he's the one that created the QR code that now links the historical marker to the City of Ferrysburg's historical page, and you can listen to the audio read, which here again becomes now universally accessible, and also is the first one in the state of Michigan to be able to provide that to all audience to be able to enjoy Hezekiah's past. This is just a little tidbit that once school found out that I was doing this collaboration with a couple students, and they were recognized by the Ottawa County ISD School Board through a proclamation that we had approved with the city. The Doing More Together caught wind of it and did a press release on the collaboration that between the Ottawa County Career Line Tech Center and the City of Ferrysburg created this really neat legacy for the state of Michigan. And if you want to visit it, it's on Smith's Bridge. It's on the corner of Spring Lake, West Spring Lake Road and 168th. There's a link on this website that goes to the City of Ferrysburg website, and then also a couple of articles that were written really expanding out on what the 2 students did to really bring light to this marker in the Tri-City area. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you for that. And we'll be sure also to send out these links with the email after the program too. So if you didn't have a chance to get all of those down, if you want to check that out. So thank you for that. And next, I think we would like to have Kimberly Van Driel. And you have your choice if you'd like to stand. Okay. So. Okay. Let's see this one, right? Okay.
Hello, everyone. So I just want to kind of go over a little bit of what we do, like why I even am doing the projects and talking about the projects I'm about to. So I work for Downtown Grand Rapids, Inc. I'm basically a curator for downtown through parks and programming and events and all the public art. So why Downtown Grand Rapids, Inc. is even invested in doing public art to begin with is because it creates a sense of place. So I always like to show these kind of images of these iconic art installations from all over the world. Immediately when you see them, you think of that place. And that's what all about placemaking is about, really, and building a downtown and a community is creating that sense of place. So we do that, I do that with art and parks, right? So we support art and placemaking projects in many different ways. Obviously, there's benefits to health, equity, inclusion, economic impact, again, but creating a sense of belonging in our community. So I get to do that with a lot of different installations. One that I started was the Rad American Women project from A to Z. So this was a project that I was inspired by a children's book from Kate Schatz out of California. And I bought this book for my niece, and I was reading it with a glass of wine one night, and I was like, yes, art installation. We can paint mechanical boxes all through downtown to liven our streets, right? These ugly boxes. So we hired 27 female identifying artists to paint a woman from that book that they most identified with, and then a start box. So then we created a walking tour. You can take tours. We offer free tours all the time, but you can download the app for free and do that. We brought in the author to Grand Rapids to do a tour with GRPS and the museum schools, and hosted happy hours and public library events. So to kind of get the book out and promote the program that we have. This is still a program that is actively used downtown. We have thousands of people that visit these mechanical boxes throughout the year. So, but when she was here, she said something to me that, you know, she travels all over the world and it's rare that anything is named after a woman, and that like hit me hard, right? I'm like, yes, totally right. Let's do something to change this. That's how I created the Women's Way project. And rather than listening to myself talk, I have a video that our team did. I don't know if I can play it from here. You're supposed to be able to. Oh, yay, good for me. Few different points that we're really working towards, and honoring local history, that's honoring women, that's activating alleyways, and trying to move things forward with streets. This project was inspired by the author Kate Schatz, who wrote the Rad American Women book from A to Z. And when Kate was here, she had said something that really stuck with me, and that was that she travels all over the world, and it's rare that she ever sees anything named after a woman. Not a park, not a street, not a plaza, nothing. And that really stuck with me. I was like, you know, what can we do to change that? And we're working really hard right now to activate underutilized spaces in the city. So alleys are a global trend right now that are being reactivated and looked at as different public spaces. So when you're trying to tell someone that, hey, meet me in this alley, it's very hard because there's no name for it. And I was like, this is perfect. Name the street after local women who kind of trailblazed the path for us. The alley that we're here in today, it's a dirt gravel road, and so we'll be paving this street as a first step to activating this, and then we'll be able to go in and add seating and more artwork.
I mean, this year is the centennial for women to be able to vote, but it's not really the centennial for all women to be able to vote. And having a project like this during a time period where we're having all of these conversations surrounding civil rights and what it means, I think is even bigger. So for the artists that are participating in this project, you know, it's not just like a one-off where it's let me paint rainbows and butterflies for everybody to see. It's more like, let me tell the story of history and how this woman impacted our community and how women are still impacting our community and what it's meaning and what it's leading to. You know, it's the history presenting the future.
So I was able to, with this idea, team up with Lions and Rabbits Art Gallery and Center for the Arts to be able to work with artists specifically. And it wasn't just women this time, it was men should be honoring us as well. So let's get some male identifying artists as well to help paint these alleyways. And there's one thing too that I should mention, the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council called me and they were like, we love what you did with Rad American Women, but it should be local women. I'm like, you're right. So let's do that too. So acknowledging the fact that women in alleys history isn't so great, right? That's a pretty negative history that we have with alleyways. So I wanted to acknowledge that specifically and flip the script in a positive way for ourselves and change how we feel about being in these alley spaces as public spaces. So we went in, mural was first thing that we did, honoring this woman, a street name as well. And then we go in and do ribbon cutting, plaque honoring these ladies as well. And then adding festoon lighting is next, more events as public spaces, because most people don't think of renting out these spaces, but you can, of course. And then adding seating and greenery and all of that kind of stuff. So it was just a first step. So the first one we did was with for in honor of Harriet Woods Hill. The next one was Angelina Kelsa Yob, Ethel B. Coe, G.R. Chicks Alley, Morelia Ortiz Blakely, and then we're adding another one in honor of Dr. Ella Mary Sims this year, and then also working with the Latino Community Coalition to add another one by the Community Foundation. They wanted to be involved in this project, and they specifically chose their alley downtown that they wanted to be representative of their community, and they did this huge community outreach program that we were able to fund to find out history from the Latin community where it's not documented, right? Like, it's so hard to find women from our past that are Latinas from history that's documented. So they worked very hard for the community to nominate members of their family and to tell the story that wasn't told. And they created a documentary that's going to be released in April, and they're doing an open public showing if you're interested at Studio Park downtown. So they'll be able to share what they want to do and how they want to name that alley as a first step, and then they'll go in and actually activate it. So that's next. Another program that we just did last year with Dwelling Place was to honor Black history of Grand Rapids in the Hartside community area. So we were able to fund 5 different murals honoring Black history. And these are the 5 murals and the artists and their artist statement and their inspiration from their own words about their mural and their piece. So this one's done by Jasmine Bruce. This one is from Kincoons and the Healthcare Consortium with the LGBTQ plus community as well. So this is a program too that we're going to be doing again here this summer and adding at least 4 new large-scale murals in the downtown as well. This is Dustin Hunt, and this was Dr. Ella Mary Sims. He did so. By doing this, we knew we wanted to make this one a Women's Way alley. So some members of her family came out for the ribbon cutting of this, and then we're gonna officially make it a Women's Way project this summer, and her entire family will come back here for a big event. And this one is on South Division as well, 235. And then another one on South Division as well. So lots of different ways of honoring our local history and continuing that effort. I love history. Definitely don't have a degree in it, but very interested in all things history. So it's really great to be able to kind of connect the dots of public art and placemaking and city building with history. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. And next we'll have Matthew, and he would also like to come to stand, I believe, which is fine. Do you have one of these? Okay. Okay. Mary, can you assist me a little bit, please? Bear with us. Thank you.
Everybody. My name is Matt Vriesman. I'm very used to presenting slides in front of teenagers, which I do all day, every day, but this is a kind of a scarier audience to me, so if you guys could just make some noise, and yeah, thank you. Faces. The fact that I have all of your attention is kind of freaking me out, but bear with me. So I created a website called Anti-Racist APUSH. APUSH is APUS History. Little background about me, I teach at Kentwood Public Schools, the coolest school district in the state of Michigan, but one of the coolest in the country for sure. I always like to brag about it. It's a really, really cool place to teach US history and world history because we have 90 different languages spoken in our district, and we have kids from all over the world, so it's that much more important for us to have a lot of different voices represented in our curriculum. I got my master's degree in US history, and my research focus was actually in, ended up being in Black political movements. And because I was doing that research and also teaching high school US history, I realized there was a very large gap between what actual professional historians are talking about and what is printed in our high school textbooks, which was a big problem for me because I'm like, wait, if historians don't believe this, what am I even teaching, right? Is this, I don't know, American patriotism class or something, but not history class? So anyway, here is what the website looks like. I don't know anything about creating a website, but I've had had the idea, and someone in our Kentwood community thought it was a cool idea, and they knew about how to make websites. So anything about it that looks cool has nothing to do with me. So here's a website. It's organized by APUS history units. So here is all the units. And for example, I've highlighted here's Unit 7, which is 1890 to 1945. And here are all the different lessons that I have made available to other APUSH teachers around the country. Again, most of this was just created as I was in grad school, and I would learn something new. And I've taught US history for 9 years, and now it's been 15 years, but while I was in grad school, I've taught this for 9 years, and I never knew that. And actually, pretty sure the textbook says something the opposite of that. And so I would just kind of add to my own curriculum. And that's kind of where all this came from. So it's more for a teacher crowd, but any teachers interested in looking for free lesson plans, I got everything that teachers need with objectives and all the fun teacher talk on the website. And where it really got started, like I said, my research was in Black political movements, and this line from the most popular AP US history textbook in the country, The American Pageant, says this in the chapter on the New Deal. All students have to know that there's a political demographic realignment during the New Deal, that in the election of 1936, for the first time, the vast majority of African Americans started to vote for the Democratic Party. So kids have to know that to take the class. And typically, if there's a bullet point in our concepts that we have to teach, the textbook's going to devote 2-3 pages for that. Like the Vietnam War is a bullet point, right? And that's a whole chapter. And so this is also a bullet point about the political realignment. And this is the only sentence. And it says, Blacks, several million of whom had appreciated welcome relief checks, had now largely shaken off their traditional allegiance to the Republican Party. And that, especially as I was taking a Black political class, I'm like, wow, that does not sound right at all. So I decided to make my whole research project for the thesis I was going to defend about this topic. I was curious, what historians believe that? This sounds like a debate more than the textbook has presented it. And what really surprised me is when I wanted to do that research project and I got into it, I found out that that's not even a debate. And I just came across historian after historian after historian who had completely debunked the idea that Black Americans became Democrats because of welfare checks. That is not backed up by the historical record. It's not backed up by historians. And then as I dig into the primary source research, it's not backed up by the primary source research at all. So I'm like, this has got to be a lesson plan for kids to go through. So I created this lesson, and it's a fantastic lesson because the kids aren't just trying to memorize a fact. We're asking this question, Okay, the textbook says that Black Americans are Democrats because of welfare. Is that true? And then we get into the secondary literature a little bit, then the primary source literature a little bit. And now all of a sudden, we're not even going to have the debate about whether that's true or not. The question is, why the heck does the textbook say that? And now all of a sudden, you've pulled back the curtain, you've got kids invested because they're not trying to memorize a fact. They're mad. This textbook, you know what I mean? Like, I trusted the adults in my life. I wanted to learn history. I took AP US history because I love history. Why are they printing this? That's not true. And then all of a sudden you have, now history class really begins, and we're not doing boring high school history, we're doing actual history. I know that's not local, but you asked where it got started, so that's how it got started. The purpose of anti-racist APUSH is really, my kids come into my classroom and they, before they ever meet me, before they ever take US history class, they have an understanding about racial inequities in our society. They understand the economic and cultural geography of West Michigan. They know where certain type of people live and what type of people have what resources. They come into that before anyone ever teaches them in school. And so my job, my number one job in my classroom is really to help them understand the context of their situation and that these racial disparities are not natural, that they have been created. And in fact, we learned that race isn't even real. It's not even a scientific thing, okay? It's been created. Now, of course, the elephant in the room, even some of my dear family members who are very outspoken critics of critical race theory being taught to their children. So it's kind of elephant in the room, high school teacher, anti-racism. My pushback to that is I actually think my class is a very oddly patriotic space. If you can invite kids in, pull back the curtain, let's not memorize facts, let's talk, why is our society this way? And you just ask kids, hey, what do you think a good society looks like? Like, what would be a perfect country if you're gonna start? They start describing the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence. Like, those are really great ideas, and they know that. And that's what they want the country to be. So my approach, this Langston Hughes quote from this poem is really the best description of American history I've ever read. And it really is a patriotic message. Langston Hughes wants America to be America so badly because America is such a great idea. So he says, oh, let America be America again, that land that never has been yet and yet must be the land where every man is free. So I really think you can get kids to buy into the idea that, yes, I want to be an engaged citizen, right? And I think if you take my class, even though we say anti-racist a lot, we talk about race and the power of history, my students, I just know, are much more likely to think, oh, the State of the Union's on tonight, I gotta watch, right? My students are, because of this class, are so much more engaged. They're, all they want to do is talk about the Supreme Court nominee hearings right now, So I think when you can take an honest approach to history, kids are into it. So that's my argument for anyone to teach more anti-racist lessons. Okay. I should probably get to local history. Guys, I'm just going to go on about anti-racism. So anyway, we spend a lot of time talking about how race is not real. Kids always love this slide on day one of the school year. Of course, you ask them which two women are the same race, and they're going to say B and C. And they say, oh, race isn't real. Genetics, DNA, that is real. And so they're kind of interested by this. Women from Western Europe and Western Africa have more similar DNA than women from East Africa and Indonesia do. So women B and C here have literally no scientific biological ties at all. The reason why B and C are grouped is because of American law. Okay? So that's a whole anti-racism 101. Long story short, my students come to me, they can see the wealth gap. They can see achievement gaps and opportunity gaps. They realize that. And so my job is for them to, instead of looking at those gaps, like, well, that's just the way it is. I guess community A must be harder working and smarter because they have all this stuff. And community B just isn't really good at figuring things out. That's why they're in poverty. That's a racist idea. And so that idea comes from observing the wealth gap without understanding the historical process that created that wealth gap. So pretty much my class is all about, this right here. All right, local history. Real quickly, I won't get into all of this, but most of my lessons, it's US history class, and I'm interacting with teachers in California, Texas, New York a lot. So it's really mostly US history, but the best lesson that I have, people around the country who like the site don't really use it that much, but the best lesson for my kids is a lesson that I was able to make with the public library. They invited me in, we went into the archives, and we told the story of the fight against Jim Crow in Grand Rapids, Michigan in the 1920s. So every lesson, for every lesson, I've got lesson plans and handouts for students. So this was the one that my kids just absolutely loved, the fight against Jim Crow in Grand Rapids. The lesson, we made this map, and this is showing where Black families have lived historically in Grand Rapids. And each little red dot, they can go through and they can click, understand some part of the local experience. There's a key theater that has segregated seating. This is going to be where the big fight against Jim Crow is going to happen. Here, this one. Kids have a general understanding that the nickname of our city is Furniture City, but they often don't know that it was really Furniture City for white residents, because the furniture factory owners got together and did lock out Black workers. So we're talking about, where does West Michigan middle class wealth originate, right? In these factories downtown, and the Black residents were not allowed to work there, right? And so why is there a huge wealth and achievement gap in Grand Rapids, in Kentwood? Here's where you go to start to understand that. And then, of course, we not only talk about these instances of Jim Crow in our own city, but also the reaction against it. And when you start learning and start showing pictures of houses around Grand Rapids, I have kids going, oh my good, that's my church, right? Hey, my grandma lives right there. Oh wow, can we go to that? Like, is that a museum, right? Like, let's go to this museum where Langston Hughes was there. Like, we just did a whole unit on him in English class, and he was here right south of Wealthy Street on James Street. This is so cool. And they assume it's a museum. And then we look at Google Maps, and like, but those are just apartments? There's no historical marker? Why not? Why don't we value this incredibly cool history? And that's the discussion that you want to have. I think, or I should say, those are the best discussions to have with teenagers. They come into my class, they've heard about Rosa Parks and Thurgood Marshall since kindergarten. Of course, they should know about these two heroes of the civil rights movement. But I argue to them, but do you know about Dr. Emmett Bolden? Do you know about the lawyer Oliver M. Green? Because the reason why Rosa Parks and Thurgood Marshall are famous for standing up to Jim Crow, being NAACP lawyers, they were just using the strategy that was used in Grand Rapids, Michigan 30 years before Rosa Parks refused to get up from her seat, before Brown v. Board. Oliver Green contacted the NAACP, and the lesson plan goes to the whole story of the fight against the theater. And lastly, I'm not a historian. These are the people who told the story. I just read their books and then went into the archives and found some cool stuff. So it's not, I didn't uncover any of this history. I just read what actual historians did and found a way to make it relevant for our high school kids. And the discussion afterwards, amazing. We don't have anything. Well, there was a plaque of Dr. Emmett Bolden somewhere. But our kids are, how can I learn about Rosa Parks every single year? There's downtown, we got Rosa Parks Circle, but I didn't know about Emmett Bolden. Why not? One of my kids, is like, well, maybe because, maybe our education is trying to point us to how messed up Mississippi and Alabama were, right? I don't know if there's a huge conspiracy theory why Rosa Parks Circle isn't named Emmett Bolden, but just getting kids to think about these things, is so powerful. So anyway, more questions. Here's the website. If you have any teachers, everything's free. And
Thank you so much. And I would like to thank all of our panelists so much for their contributions today to this important topic.